Welcome to Conscious Action for Truth, the cat in cat chats. Today is New Year's Day 2021. Happy New Year to all. I believe it's going to be an extraordinary year, and before too long we will all have reason to celebrate like we never have before. So with me today to talk about some really exciting New Mexico news is a true warrioress of conscious action for truth, Ana Garna. She is an attorney who's been litigating civil cases in New Mexico for 40 years. On December the 21st, a most auspicious date, her team filed a 125-page case against the New Mexico governor, Lujan Grisham, and public health directors for violations of constitutional rights as a result of the government's response to COVID. She also filed with Tom Rentz of Ohio a case against the CDC for amending the rules on reporting deaths, but only for one type, COVID. Welcome, Ana. And I would add that you are truly an attorney for the people.
Thank you. That's my only job. I've always been an attorney representing the little guy against institutions. So this is just another example of how I've done it.
Great. So the New Mexico economy is devastated. At least 355 restaurants have permanently closed, and many more small businesses, while the big corporate stores remain open. People's mental and physical health have suffered more from the governor's response to COVID-19 than the virus itself. And so many have just given up their basic rights of assembly, worship, and ability to do business without fighting back, because there's been such a fear and shaming campaign waged by the governor and the media that seem to be in lockstep with her capricious and irrational measures. But you and your team, collaborating with a group of brave souls in Ohio, have courageously chosen to fight back in the courts with truth and facts as your weapon of choice.
Absolutely.
So, Ana, can you tell us what motivated you to take this bold action, and what is the basic premise of the lawsuit?
Okay, so what motivated me to take this action is I was just becoming so angry about the fact that we as good citizens, healthy citizens, were being locked in our homes. Businesses were starting to suffer, and that was very apparent. She would close a business, close the restaurants, then she would reopen them, and then she would close them again. And there's been basically a psychological terrorism that's gone on with the people. And I recognize those tactics. And I started studying it and realizing that this was a big hoax. There was another agenda afoot. I didn't know what the agenda was, and I don't need to prove anything about what a bigger agenda is. I just need to prove that this is a bunch of lies. And as I started researching it, I found more and more research that absolutely gave me all the evidence I needed to feel confident that we needed to go forward and do something about this. In the meantime, I was also watching my courageous fellow attorneys file suit against the governor. Unfortunately, most of them were not very successful. And I kept saying to myself, why aren't they getting to the root of the problem? They're not challenging the pandemic. They're not challenging the fact that there is no emergency. They're not challenging that. They're actually conceding, they were conceding that there was a health crisis that needed the government's control. And the way the government was controlling it was, of course, by controlling us and taking all of our constitutional liberties away. So it really was a calling of God. I mean, that's the bottom line. I didn't really want to do this. I thought I was going to retire in the next year, but I considered this and I was going, well, if I don't do it, who is? So I said yes to the call. So, and the second part of your question was, I think, what's the lawsuit really about? Is that a fair assessment?
The basic premise of the lawsuit, yeah.
Okay, so the basic premise of the lawsuit is there is no emergency. If there is no emergency, then all of those restrictions that they were enacting in response to the emergency are invalid. And that's where we're attacking it. There is no emergency. And the way we get to that are we answer three questions. Number one, how dangerous is this disease really? And we've had more deaths, unfortunately, and more fallout and damage as a result of the response than we have to COVID. And then the second one is how reliable are the PCR tests on which all of the fear mongering and hysteria is based on. And the PCR tests are completely unreliable for diagnosing anything. And the third question we ask is, how much fallout and damage, collateral damage, is being done as a result of all of this? And this is what we tried to answer in our lawsuit. And I think we did it.
Certainly from what I've read, I think you did it brilliantly. And what I love about this suit is it's, I can read it and I can understand it. So anyone who really wants to know the facts can read through this lawsuit and understand it's not beyond us mere mortals because it's legal, right? I love that.
When we're in front of a judge, our judge is probably not going to be someone who's schooled in science. Very few attorneys are. And I have an advantage of having a pre-med background, so I was schooled in science, but I've done litigation that pertain to scientific principles like medical malpractice litigation and some FDA litigation. But the point is, I had to write this complaint so that a judge with not any scientific background could read and understand what we were saying. And as you point out, we really tried to put it in plain English. Yes, there's a lot of science in it, but we tried to put it in plain English so that anyone could understand it.
Yeah, I think that is brilliant. And there may be some people listening who's having knee-jerk responses like now, like, how can she possibly say it's a hoax? my friend died, or my aunt died, or isn't that the standard response we see for anyone who even begins to challenge that this was a real pandemic? What would you say to that? Is there something you can, from the lawsuit, just a little example that would?
I don't know that that any death is tragic, and we acknowledge that. And there are some people who have died from a virus, a respiratory virus that's called COVID. We don't really know what the virus is because the virus itself has never been isolated. And that also contributes to the problem with the test, because how do you test for something if you haven't isolated it? Secondly, how in the world can you vaccinate or create a vaccination if you haven't isolated the agent that you're trying to vaccinate against? So we have a lot of problems with a big piece missing here. That doesn't mean—
Hold on, just a sec, Anna. You just put out a total shocker there.
Oh, I did?
The coronavirus hasn't been isolated?
That's correct. It has not been isolated. And as recently as last week, a reporter went to the, it's called the Ministry of Health, I believe, in Ireland. And she had basically a Freedom of Information Act request in Ireland asking them for all documents that would prove that they've isolated the virus. And they said, we have scoured everything, we've looked at everything, and unfortunately we have no documents that are responsive to your request, meaning there is no evidence that it's ever been isolated.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's a huge underpinning to this suit, I would say, is it not? I mean, we've locked the country down for a virus that hasn't been isolated. This is
Correct. No.
so.
And what they've done, Mahara, is they've actually isolated little snippets of RNA that resemble a coronavirus. It might be from a SARS virus, which is a coronavirus, but they've isolated little snippets of RNA, fed it into a computer, and had the computer basically recreate a genetic sequence. In other words, it's made up. It's fake.
Wow. Well, there's a couple of other things that I noticed in the lawsuit that were stood out. And you inserted a chart of communist coercive methods compared with COVID-19 response.
Yes. Did you see?
Let me just give our listeners a little sample of it. So this comes from the Biederman report of 1956, chart of coercion. Number 1, isolation, deprive individual of social support of his ability to resist. COVID-19, social distancing, isolation from loved ones. Then there's monopolization of perception, fixes all attention upon immediate predicament. In COVID case, restrict movement, create monotony, boredom, prevent gathering. This is really mind-blowing seeing this comparison. How did you come up with that or find that? It's very powerful.
It is powerful. And those are the techniques, the tactics that were used on American prisoners of war in, I believe, World War II by the Korean and communist Chinese. And I had, Tom and I were aware of the psychological manipulation that's going on, and Tom had addressed it in his Ohio complaint, which was filed several months before we were able to file the New Mexico complaint. And during the time that we were working on the complaint, one of our people in the group that's supporting me found this article. In fact, she's a psychologist, and she found the Biederman chart of coercion. And I had run across it earlier on in studying this, and I couldn't find it anywhere. And I was getting a little frantic because I wanted to see it again. And it appeared in my email box. It seems almost magical, but that's how we've been directed to a lot of the research and information that we've come across.
It's really remarkable. I just have to say to anyone, when you read through this suit and you see this chart, that the parallels are creepy, I guess you might say. So the other thing that really stood out to me is this new code of cause of death for reporting for doctors and coroners at the beginning of the pandemic. That seems very suspicious to me.
Doesn't it? Yes. They didn't recode a single other type of death. This wasn't a rewrite of the coroner's handbook that the CDC put out in 2003. For 17 years, they had been using this type of coding for deaths that said, and it had several spaces, several places that you could put the primary cause that actually led to the death, and then supporting causes, for example, comorbidities and that sort of thing. But the primary cause, let's say if you have the flu, the primary cause of death typically is pneumonia from the flu. That's what typically will take people out. That's true with COVID as well. It's also associated with a viral pneumonia or a bacterial pneumonia. So what the CDC did is they decided to change the way of coding for that one disease. And by doing so, they even admitted in their papers that this would result in more COVID-caused deaths, even though they weren't really caused by COVID. It was the manipulation of how they now wanted the doctors to report that. So that's why we sued the CDC as well. We sued the CDC and the officials in the CDC for doing this. It's part of how they supported their inflated numbers and part of how they created the hysteria and the fear amongst people.
So this is really the difference between dying with COVID and dying of COVID. Yes?
Correct.
Yes. So our numbers, you know, we have our governor who's putting some people into panic, and we have flashing signs on the highways, and, you know, that oh, the latest this week, how many thousand more people have died of COVID, and yet we don't see people dropping dead in the streets. We don't see our hospitals particularly crowded, if at all. So are you saying this is really the manipulation of numbers?
It's a huge manipulation of numbers. That's exactly what it is. And even the CDC admitted when they went through and looked at all of the COVID-caused or COVID-related deaths, that 94% of them had comorbidities. On average, I think the number was 2.6. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 of other comorbidities. And these are people who didn't necessarily even die with COVID. Sometimes they just died with a positive PCR test. I can give you some examples of how people, some nurses have told me from hospitals around here, that, for example, a young woman patient was admitted who had been severely beaten by her domestic partner. That's another terrible collateral damage, is the domestic violence that's happened. But she came in with severe injuries from that and subsequently died of a subdural hematoma. In the meantime, they tested her blood to see if she had a positive PCR test, because every time you go into the hospital now, they're testing you. And she did have a positive test. She did not die from COVID. She died from trauma, and they coded it as a COVID death. There are many, many examples like that, but we have people who have worked in the local hospitals who will testify about the misdiagnosis of COVID deaths.
Amazing. So there's huge fallout from our governor's actions in this state. And the big fallout is the incredible violation of the Constitution that so many seems to have forgotten how important that document is in the United States. I know certainly the last few years I've learned more about it than I ever knew, having grown up in England, and America was the colony that got away. So what did I know about the Constitution? But so the violations of the Constitution in the lawsuit, how much is that a part of it?
Well, Mahara, we have to fit a legal theory into the terrible human fallout factor. So I think the human fallout is even far worse than the violations of our constitutional rights. The children who are being scared into incredible, just a state of anxiety and fear because they have to wear masks at school. The neurological damage that's being done to children from wearing masks, and it may be irreversible. There's some studies saying that we're going to have some large upswing of Alzheimer's and mental problems with like dementia because of the mask wearing. And there are many, many problems associated with that. The children are basically, they've been immune from COVID. They basically don't get COVID and they don't spread it. So why are we having this population bear the brunt of some of the restrictions when the people who need to be protected are really the elderly and the vulnerable, the ones with health problems? Those are the people who need to be protected. But the children are bearing, I think, a disproportionate brunt in this whole thing. That's the terrible fallout. Yes, we have violations of our Constitution. That we have to allege that to get into federal court. And that's the framework that we presented. But the human toll is enormous. It is.
I totally agree. So as far as the lawsuit goes, the idea is to lift the lockdown, stop all this insanity from our governor. What is the reality of that happening? How soon? What happens next?
Well, they will get an opportunity to answer the lawsuit, and there will probably be a flurry of motions trying to get us out on technical grounds, because they don't really want the truth to be exposed. So we'll have a few battles, a few skirmishes in court that we hope to win, of course. And we will go forward. What we want to do is go forward with discovery so that we can expose the lies further. We have a lot of scientific background. We have scientists who are willing to help us. We have nurses who have worked at hospitals who are willing to testify. But I want to be able to get at the information that the state has and show that they knew or should have known that their numbers were fake, their numbers were false, and they were running a campaign of fear and hysteria. And we need to have that, because these people need to be held accountable. You know, first we want to get all that rolled back. We want to get our restrictions completely rolled back, because if there's no emergency, not one of these restrictions is legal, not one. So I know I've been criticized for saying that I want it completely open. I want to open the schools. I want to open New Mexico without restrictions, and that seems radical.
Well, they did it in North Dakota, right? They haven't had any restrictions, and they're in much better shape than we are. I've seen graphs, which I'm sure you've seen from around the world, that as soon as the restrictions and the masks and the lockdowns happen, the COVID cases went up.
Yes.
So the common sense is needed in this situation. So how, we need to get our state opened up yesterday.
Yes. Yes.
How, as far as timing goes, you said a flurry of motions. I mean, is this something that's going to go on for months and months before? Is there any action that can be taken to shift things quickly while the rest of the lawsuit goes on?
Yes, and there are, and we're planning those. I'm not at liberty to discuss all of our strategies, Mahara, because the element of surprise is certainly a good one. But our team is working on strategies that will bring it before the court a little bit sooner than, say, before 6 months or a year, well before that. So we're working on those strategies now, because we know that it should have been, all of these restrictions should have been lifted a long time ago, but they haven't been. And I think we have enough information for a judge to be able to side with us on getting some of these restrictions lifted. I don't know how many. We're going to ask for all of them, and we'll see what we'll take what we get, and we'll keep moving forward until the judge is convinced that all of them should be lifted. And even if we have to go all the way to the Supreme Court, we're prepared to fight this as long as it takes and as hard as it takes.
Great, great. Do you anticipate other states jumping on board too?
Absolutely. In fact, I've already been contacted by people in 3 other states almost as soon as we filed our complaint. And they want to know what they can do to help their state. So there are people contacting Tom and me about how they can do it in their state. And we want to be able to help other people as well. But it's a labor of love. It's not, nobody's paying me for this. We were able to raise money for the cost, which is really good. But the 2 New Mexico attorneys, Jonathan Diener and I, are not working and getting paid for this. This is a labor of love.
Fantastic. That's why, as I introduced you as really a people's attorney, and I will put a link underneath this video where people can donate. I'll put a link to the lawsuit. Is there anything else, Anna, that you'd like to finish with? Anything you want to say?
I want the people of New Mexico not to lose hope and to know that the vaccination is not the answer, but standing up for our rights is the answer, and that we do need support. It's a grassroots movement, and we do need the support, and we do need the help with covering costs, because there will be substantial cost involved in the lawsuit. And every bit that comes in, if people can only pay $5 here or there, every little bit helps and will help with this, with moving forward in this lawsuit. And I just feel like so many people have reached out and supported us in this, that I know that there are a lot more people who know the truth like we do, Mahara, and want to see this succeed. And I ask for prayers too. Whether you can donate or not, send your prayers, because this is a bigger battle than just a little court battle. This is really, in many ways, a spiritual battle, and we view it that way.
I absolutely see it that way too. So Anna, thank you so much. I hope at some point when things progress, you'll come back and give us more info. So I urge everyone to read this lawsuit in bite-sized chunks, of course. It's taken me a few days. I read a little bit here and there. But you'll learn so much about the reality of the situation and how you really don't need to be afraid of this virus.
Right.
Any more than you would the flu.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, if you're sick, you stay home, just like we always did in any prior flu season. This is no worse than a seasonal flu. You know, it's roughly the same level of infection, same level of death. Unfortunately, the seasonal flu does kill people every year. So people need to look at the numbers of what's happened in the past and the numbers that we have this year and compare them. There aren't even any excess deaths that are occurring. The deaths that you would expect from all of the COVID deaths are non-existent. It seems as if they're being coded where they would have been heart disease or dying from pneumonia or dying from anything else. I mean, did you know that
flu has disappeared this year, hasn't it? I heard flu doesn't exist anymore. So woohoo!
They stopped counting flu and they stopped counting pneumonia, and that, so this seasonal flu could just be the flu. So they stopped counting it so that they can inflate the COVID numbers.
Yep. And so then you might ask, but why? And that, my friends, is a vast subject for another day.
Right.
So once again, Anna, thank you. This will be wonderful information for people, for those who don't yet know about the lawsuit. And hopefully it will help you and all of us to keep going, as you said, with hope and prayers.
Thank you, Mahara.